Hawley Harvey Crippen was born in Coldwater, Michigan in 1862. In 1884 he graduated from Cleveland Homeopathic Medical College. Over the next 12 years he practiced as an ear and eye specialist across various states in the US. In 1887 he married Charlotte Bell in San Diego. A year later, Crippen and Charlotte had a son, Otto Hawley Crippen. Unfortunately, his wife died of a stroke in 1892 while living at Salt Lake City. He was now alone with a young son, and when he was offered a job with Dr. Munyon's, a homeopathic pharmaceutical company based in New York, he thought it best to leave his son in the care of his parents and take the job. While there, he met and married Cora Turner, a young 17-year-old singer whose ambition was to tread the boards in the music halls, going by the stage name Belle Elmore. Her friends had encouraged her to try, but she wasn't seen as good enough. Crippen also encouraged her and indulged her with singing lessons. She was bright, cheerful and feisty. She was a good-looking, vivacious woman with dark eyes and long flowing black hair. It was also claimed she was rather promiscuous, as it was claimed at the time of them meeting and forming a relationship she was also a mistress to another man. Crippen was a total opposite of Cora, being a small, slightly built, pale-looking man with a receding hairline and large moustache. He had dark eyes that looked at you through rimmed glasses. By all accounts, he wasn't what they would call a man's man. Regardless, they married in 1887 and moved to St. Louis. It was while there Crippen discovered his wife's real name wasn't Cora Turner, but Kunigund Makamotze. Apologies for name mispronunciation. She was born to Russian and German parents. Crippen and his wife moved to England in 1900. This was Crippen's second time in the UK. The first was in 1883, when at the age of 21 he attended various hospitals in London as part of his education in medicine. Crippen's later move to London was as a manager for Munyon's advertising business in patent medicines, and it was based in Shaftesbury Avenue. He also started working as a dentist. Cora, still determined to be a singer on stage, tried the English music hall scene. Didn't go as well as she had hoped, but Crippen was happy to pay for her pretty gowns and jewellery. But after a while it became apparent she wasn't going to realise her dream of fame. But she did still appear at times on stage, taking what she could get, and it would seem she'd resigned herself to that. They continued to follow the entertainment circles, and Cora became a member of the Women's Music Hall Guild. Crippen was happy to be by his wife's side as she entertained her small circle of friends, and he would often be seen giving her pieces of jewellery. They did form some good friendships, one being with fellow American music hall performer Clara Martinetti and her husband Paul. They dined and played whist regularly, and spent many hours talking about their love of music and dance. In 1905 they rented a small semi-detached house in a quiet, leafy part of Camden Town, number 39 Hilldrop Crescent. Life, it would seem, went on rather normally for the residents of Hilldrop. To the outside world they seemed to have a good marriage, although it was being disputed with claims that he was henpecked by Cora and she flaunted lovers in front of him. Also not proved. It would come to light that the Crippens did have some domestics, and it was witnessed by a then boarder at the home. It was apparently stated to be one-sided, and that Cora chided her husband on more than one occasion. It was around this time Crippen had formed a bond with a pretty young secretary, Ethel Le Neve. She was quiet and reserved, a total opposite of Cora's outward character. She became his escape from home life, enjoying the companionship she gave him. She had become his constant companion every day, not only with his work life but also outside of it. His friends and work colleagues seemed to know about the closeness of the couple, as Crippen didn't try and hide it at all. There was a storm a-brewing, allegedly. Crippen's life at home was by all accounts argumentative. He felt demeaned by his wife. The extravagant lifestyle they tried to show outwardly wasn't reflected in the home, as they were living as cheaply as they could. The extravagance they portrayed was a smokescreen to the reality of it. And the passion for Miss Le Neve was growing, and that passion, along with the theory that if she had just left him, she would have taken all of her expensive clothes and jewellery that he'd paid for and saw them as his possessions as much as they were his wife's. But if she were to cease to exist, he'd have the best of both worlds, and this would be the prosecution's official theory as to why Crippen would take the life of his wife. In February 1910, Cora Crippen went missing when her friend Clara Martinetti, who was apparently the first person to find her disappearance suspicious, inquired about Cora's absence. Crippen responded that she had to return to America as an emergency had arisen. After a few weeks of no correspondence from Cora, Clara grew more concerned and once again asked Crippen about Cora's whereabouts, stating that she hadn't heard anything from her friend, which she found odd. Dr. Crippen, she noted, was always evasive when it came to Cora and would only respond that she was fine. Cora's other close friend Lillian Nash, known on stage as Lil Hawthorne, also found this suspicious, especially when told later Cora had died while in America. As Mrs. Hawthorne and her husband John Nash were good friends of the superintendent Frank Frost, they went to see him on the 30th of June 1910. Cora had been missing for nearly 5 months by this time. They relayed their suspicions regarding the whereabouts of Cora Crippen. After hearing what they had to say, he instructed Chief Inspector Walter Dew, a highly regarded man who had been one of the policemen hunting for Jack the Ripper, to listen to what the Nashes had to say. He learned that they had returned to London after an American tour to hear their good friend had passed away. They spoke of Crippen's work, how he was in a partnership with an American dentist, Dr. Rylance, and his managerial role with Munyon's mail-order medicine company. They went on to say how they heard from Dr. Crippen that Cora had returned to America on February the 2nd and passed away there on the 23rd of March. But they had noted there had been cheques signed by her in that time. A doubtful Dew didn't think anything untoward would come from this case, so he went to interview members of the Women's Guild. All the statements he collected said almost the same thing, how they had been told by Dr. Crippen she had gone to America in response to an emergency. They then all received a black-edged letter informing them of Cora's passing. The Martinettis told Dew about their own suspicions, and how they were piqued all the more when they saw Crippen at a benevolent fundraising with his secretary, Miss Ethel Le Neve. And after more inquiries, Crippen eventually told them his wife Cora was ill, but he had been told not to worry. A few weeks later, he informed the Martinettis that Cora had died of pneumonia in America. He told them she would be cremated and her ashes sent back to London. It would also be found in the inquiries that the very day Cora allegedly went to America, on February the 2nd, Crippen entered Attenborough's pawnbroker's shop asking for a loan against a diamond ring and earrings. He agreed to an £80 loan. Just a week later, Crippen pawned some more diamond jewellery for £115. Chief Inspector Dew spoke to the landlord of 39 Hilldrop and learned that Crippen had told his landlord on March the 15th that he would be leaving to move back to America, as he had inherited a home there. Dew also heard that Crippen had stayed in Dieppe with Le Neve under the names Mr. and Mrs. Crippen, after he told Cora's friends she had passed. Chief Inspector Dew decided he needed to speak to Crippen himself. After investigating, Dew went to Hilldrop Crescent on the 8th of July. On arriving at the home, he and D.S. Arthur Mitchell found Crippen's young maid in the house. After a few minutes, Ethel Le Neve came down the stairs and joined them. They found Le Neve to be unhelpful, and she told them in no uncertain terms that Mr. Crippen wasn't home. Dew then demanded she take him to see Crippen. When Crippen saw the policeman, the inspector explained to him that his wife's friends were not satisfied with what he had told them about his wife's disappearance, and that after making inquiries, he also wasn't satisfied. Crippen replied, "I suppose I'd better tell the truth. The stories I had told them about her death were untrue. As far as I know, she is still alive." He then added that he didn't want people asking any more questions about his wife, as he found it embarrassing to admit she'd left him. So he then made a statement, which was taken down by Sergeant Mitchell. He, Crippen, went to America from November to June, and when he came back he found that an American music hall artist named Bruce Miller had been a frequent visitor to their house. She had told him that this man had taken her about, and that he was very fond of her, and she of him. Crippen said that he had seen the letters to his wife from Bruce Miller ending with love and kisses to Brown Eyes. When his wife came to England from America, her manner towards him had changed. She had developed a most ungovernable temper, and seemed to think he was not good enough for her. She boasted of a man in a good position who had made a fuss of her. He never saw the man Bruce Miller, but Miller called when he was out and took her out in the evening. She and the prisoner, Crippen, continued to live together, apparently happy, but there were frequent occasions on which she got into a violent temper. She often threatened to leave him, saying she had a man she could go to. Sometime after this, he ceased to cohabit with her, but never interfered with her movements. They were of no interest to him. On January the 31st, Mr. and Mrs. Martinetti came to their place for dinner, and after they had left, his wife abused him and said she would not stand it any longer. She would leave him the next day, and he would not hear of her again. He claimed to be ashamed of this and wanted to try and cover up the scandal this would cause him. He admitted he had lied about his wife being ill and dying, and that Miss Le Neve had been his mistress for 3 years. He also admitted to not disposing of belongings his wife had left behind. He believed she had gone back to America to be with Bruce Miller. According to this statement, he and Cora were practically living separate lives. He went on to add that he didn't know what clothes his wife had or hadn't taken with her. He believed she had taken a travel bag, as one was missing, and maybe most of the jewellery, but leaving behind 3 diamond rings and a diamond brooch. He also claimed to have only given her medication to help with her bilious attacks. As for the signed cheques, he claimed she had signed some blank cheques before she left. He admitted Le Neve had worn some of Mrs. Crippen's clothing and jewellery, but on Ethel Le Neve he admitted she was now living with him as his wife. When the inspector asked about contacting someone who may know the whereabouts of Mrs. Crippen, responded with the name of her sister, Louise Mills, who lived with her husband in Brooklyn, but couldn't help with any trace of where his wife could be, only that he presumed she was with Mr. Miller. Crippen had taken his time giving his statement, as he continued to work through the entire interview. The inspector noted that he showed no sign of guilt or signs of nervousness. He was calm and polite. And at this time the inspector had no reason or thought of a crime having been committed. He was just trying to clear up what may have happened to Mrs. Crippen, and possibly find some evidence of where she may have gone. Dew wasn't totally satisfied with the statement Crippen had just given. According to Dew, Crippen was very convincing, leaving him to add later that the doctor was an accomplished liar And with that slight niggling doubt in the inspector's mind, and knowing how well this man had lied to those around him, he knew he had to look further into the disappearance of Mrs. Crippen. The inspector and the DS then interviewed Ethel Le Neve. She admitted to having moved into 39 Hilldrop at the end of February, and that she had been intimate with Mr. Crippen for about 2 to 3 years, but had known him for about 10 years, and she was employed as a typist by the same company. She told how she had known Mrs. Crippen and saw her as a friend. This would be disputed, as Cora had mentioned to a friend that she disliked the typist at her husband's office and had asked him to have her removed, but he declined, telling her the typist was valuable to the company. Le Neve went on to say Mr. Crippen had sent a note informing her that Mr. Crippen had gone back to America in early February, and asked her to hand over a package he had enclosed with a letter to a Miss May. Crippen later arrived at Albion House and gave Ethel all the information on his wife's packing and going to America. She admitted to attending a function with Crippen and wearing the diamond brooch that she says he gave her. It was later that Crippen had informed her that his wife had caught a chill on the boat that turned into pneumonia. She would also, although slightly uncomfortably, admit to staying in Dieppe with Crippen as man and wife. It was when they returned to Hilldrop that he informed her that his wife was dead. Crippen gave her his wife's furs and she moved in with them, telling everyone she was his housekeeper. The inspector, DS, Le Neve and Crippen all returned to the house on Hilldrop Crescent, so the inspector could search through some of Mrs. Crippen's belongings and papers to see if they could shed some light on her whereabouts. The inspector and DS searched all the rooms, noting that nothing seemed out of place that they could see. They then went out to the garden. Nothing looked disturbed. Then the coal cellar. Dust lay on the brick floor that made it seem that it hadn't been touched for some time. Crippen and Le Neve watched as the two policemen searched, but came up with nothing. Inspector Dew asked Crippen if he could help with anything that may lead to finding where his wife had gone, and Crippen seemed happy to help, suggesting placing adverts in newspapers, which he didn't do. On leaving, Dew turned to Crippen and told him he would need to contact Mrs. Crippen to clear this whole matter up. A description of Cora Crippen was circulated as a missing person the day after the interview. A few months went by. On Monday the 11th of July, Chief Inspector Dew and DS Mitchell went to Albion House to talk with Crippen, only to find both Crippen and Ethel Le Neve were not there. Crippen's partner, Dr. Rylance, showed them a letter he had received from Crippen. In it stated, "In order to escape trouble, I have been obliged to absent myself for a time." They were gone. Dew and Mitchell went straight round to 39 Hilldrop Crescent, and this time searched the house thoroughly. In the bedroom wardrobe, to their surprise, a revolver and cartridges was found, but Dew knew it hadn't been there before on the first search. This alarmed Dew. An innocent man wouldn't run. This time his search went further. He doubled down on his examination of the rooms, including the cellar, and dug up the garden, but they didn't find anything. He did fail to notice Cora's furs were still hanging in the house. Wouldn't she have taken them with her, as it was the middle of winter? After Inspector Dew spoke with one of Crippen's work colleagues, William Long, at a later date, he discovered that on 9th of July, the day after the first visit from the police, Crippen had asked Long to buy some boys' clothes and gave him instructions of what to buy. A puzzled Long asked why. Crippen responded he was trying to avoid a small scandal. Crippen and Le Neve had left around 1 p.m. Just as surprising to Dew was that he discovered Le Neve had been telling everyone she knew, including her parents, that she was married to Crippen and had been since Cora's death. They were on the run. What for was still to be determined. A description of the two was circulated to all ports. 39 Hilldrop Crescent was now empty, meaning Dew and Mitchell could delve deeper into what secrets, if any, there would be hidden in the house. In Dew's own words, he declared, "Let's go and have another look at that cellar." On our hands and knees we probed at the brick floor with a poker. After a while the sharp end of the poker found its way easily between two bricks, and one lifted. The brick came out, then another, and so on. Mitchell ran to get a spade from the garden. With this I worked steadily for a few minutes, then came to the evidence nauseatingly unmistakable. The stench was unbearable, driving us both into the garden for fresh air. What they discovered was human remains covered in lime, but the lime was so wet it didn't destroy the remains, but preserved them. Found along with the remains was a curling pin with hair attached, a piece of ladies' underwear, and a piece of a man's pyjama shirt, a rotted handkerchief knotted at two ends, and a piece of string. Just as shocking was the absence of a head, bones, arms, legs, and organs. Were they looking at what remained of Cora Crippen, aka Belle Elmore? The local divisional doctor, Thomas Marshall, was called, and the assistant commissioner of the CID was informed. The doctor checked the remains and noted that they looked as if they had been dumped into the hole. He would make a better evaluation once they were removed to the mortuary. The next day the body was removed and Dew continued to search. He found under the bed a box that contained two sets of pyjamas. More importantly, one odd pair of bottoms. Dew, convinced the remains were those of Cora Crippen, secured a warrant for the arrest of Hawley Harvey Crippen and Ethel Cora Le Neve for the murder of Cora Crippen. As Dew continued his investigation, the news was breaking. People were shocked to hear the news of what might have happened to Mr. Crippen's wife and the terrible, gruesome findings in the house. The papers found work colleagues and friends of Crippen, and interviews showed the depths of their shock and surprise at the news. But where was Crippen and his female companion? It was feared that the couple had tried to leave the country, so cablegrams were sent out to many countries giving a full description of the wanted two, stating that they were wanted in connection to the murder and mutilation of a woman. They gave the names Hawley Harvey Crippen, aka Peter Crippen, alias Frank, and a full physical description, and that Ethel Le Neve possibly travelling as his wife. Newspapers also had the full wanted description all over the country and abroad. At the coroner's inquest, the coroner, Dr. George Danford Thomas, explained to a packed room that they believed the found remains were those of Cora Crippen, but further investigation needed to be done. But the police had it in hand. Dew gave his evidence and assured the court that they had a full-on search for Crippen and Le Neve, and Dr. Thomas gave Dew high praise for his findings. Dr. Marshall then told of his findings from the post-mortem. So far he had determined that the remains belonged to a female, but because the body had been grotesquely mutilated, it was difficult to tell absolutely. He also believed that the body had been dissected in the cellar where it was found, adding that whoever did this took their time. The problem they had now was to determine absolutely that the remains were those of Cora Crippen. A bit of luck landed in Dew's lap when he overheard Clara Martinetti mention that Cora had a large scar on the lower part of her body. Dew knew this as a definite that a piece of skin found had the trace of a large scar on it. As the investigation moved forward, Crippen's respectable mask started to slip. The small, unassuming man had skeletons in his closet. The brother of his first wife told of some letters he had received from his sister suggesting that Crippen had got into trouble using his medical teachings. He had often passed himself off as not only a dentist, but an optician and possibly other medical doctors. The brother believed he may have been responsible for his sister's death. His sister had claimed he had forced her to have operations that were performed by him, that he wasn't qualified for. The letters had been passed on to the police, but nothing happened. The more they heard, the more they grew concerned that Crippen might slip through their fingers. The police pushed for all letters going to the friends and families of the two to be intercepted, thinking they might try to contact them under different names. If they were still in the country, they had to be laying low or in a disguise of some sort, as they were both now all over the newspapers. The story of the crime and the horrific discovery, found in 39 Hilldrop Crescent, was definitely front page news. On July the 10th, 1910, the runaway couple had managed to reach Brussels and signed into a hotel as Canadian John Robinson and his son, John Jr. John Jr. was Ethel Le Neve, dressed as a boy. They remained there for about 8 days. While there, Crippen booked a passage to sail to Canada on the Montrose, leaving on the 20th of July. All the ships leaving London after the discovery of the body had been given a detailed description of the couple, and added that they may be in disguise, especially the woman, who may be dressed as a man. It was also announced in the newspapers. The Montrose had just left England before reaching Brussels. Captain Kendall greeted his travellers before spending some downtime reading a newspaper. His interest was piqued reading about the horrific crime that had been committed in England, and the two wanted suspects were on the run and possibly trying to travel overseas. He noticed he had 2 people on board that he thought looked suspicious. Kendall decided to keep his eye on the pair, as he wasn't totally sure and didn't want to make a mistake. After spending time in the company of the Robinsons, and after some conversations with the older man, who he noted hadn't responded to his new name Robinson on more than one occasion, Captain Kendall felt confident he had the 2 suspects on board. A wireless telegraph shipped ashore was sent to his shipping company, who would pass on the message to Scotland Yard. When Scotland Yard heard the news, Inspector Dew was booked onto a faster steamship and arrived at an outpost a few days before the Montrose. It was all done cloak and dagger style in London, trying to avoid the press. When the Montrose arrived on the 31st of July, Dew, with the help of the Canadian police, boarded the Montrose in disguise of his own. Mr. Robinson was requested to go to the captain's cabin, where Dew formally arrested Crippen for the murder and mutilation of his wife Cora, in London on or around 2nd of February. When searching Crippen, a note was discovered claiming that he was going to unalive himself by jumping into the sea, as the horror of it all had become too much. This was a cover, as Crippen had claimed a quartermaster had offered to help him escape by pretending to hear a splash, then hide him until it was safe. The story wasn't believed. Crippen requested Le Neve be let go, as she hadn't done anything and knew nothing of what had happened. They were both arrested and returned back to England once extradition papers had been acquired. On returning, Crippen and Ethel were taken to court to be placed on remand with a court date to be set. Le Neve, it was thought, would only be charged with aiding and abetting. This whole case had captured the world's interest. Those involved said they had never seen anything like it before. Dr. Crippen had captured the interest of the public. People wanted to know how this unassuming man, who was said to be a good, mild man, could turn into this monster, killing his wife in a horrific way. They wanted all the grisly details, not just of the murder, but of Crippen's life and the other woman. On the 6th of September, the magistrates' court continued, with medical evidence being produced by Dr. Pepper. Pepper started with, quote, "His first impression was that the remains in situ roughly corresponded in shape, breadth and length with an adult body. He came to the conclusion that they were from a human in the prime of life and stout of build." He went on, "The remains bore the signs of an old operation in the form of a scar. A poison trace was detected in the body parts that was given to Dr. William Wilcox, and he determined the poison was hyoscine. Hyoscine was usually given to quieten someone suffering from some form of delirium. Dr. Wilcox thought whoever had given the fatal dose must have given a very large dose for it to still be present in the body after such a length of time. He went on to say that the large amount of poison in the intestines indicated that it had been taken by mouth, and the person would have lived for an hour or more before succumbing to the effects. He went on to add that the poison would put the person into a stupor and possibly make them delirious. They would then become paralysed and comatose before death. It had been discovered that on January the 19th, Crippen had bought a large dose of hyoscine, and there didn't seem to be any work-related reason for him to have needed this. The next day, at the coroner's court, Dr. Pepper gave a more in-depth description of his findings on the body parts that were found. He mentioned the remains were more than likely mutilated by someone who had some form of knowledge about the human or animal anatomy. What was left of the body was mostly fat and muscle. The skeleton had been removed, the limbs and head also removed and never found. The full statement from leading surgeon Augustus Pepper gives explicit details of the horrific find. 2 days later, Dew answered some questions at the court. He told of how his initial first visits to Dr. Crippen's office was just to get some information regarding his wife's alleged disappearance. On hearing what Crippen had to say, he didn't feel satisfied with his statement, so came to the conclusion he needed to investigate further. A few days later, the magistrate came to his decision. Sir Albert Rutson concluded that Crippen should stand trial for the charge against him. Crippen was charged that on the 1st of February he had murdered his wife, Cora Crippen. It was decided that the evidence against Le Neve was enough for her to go to trial as complicit to knowing of the murder but not involved in the act. Both Crippen and Le Neve would plead not guilty and be tried separately. In the meantime, the investigation continued. Arthur Miller was eventually found by the Pinkertons agency. He was now a married man with 2 children and hadn't heard from Cora since she sent him a Christmas card in 1909. He explained in his statement that he made at the Pinkertons' office that he and Cora, Miss Elmore, were best of friends. He added that he thought it odd that Crippen had even mentioned she would have eloped with him, as he hadn't seen her for at least 6 years and had been living in America for 4 of those, and that Dr. Crippen would probably have known this, as Cora had never hidden the friendship from her husband. There was never any sort of relationship between them. They were good friends with similar interests in the music world. Back in London, as the coroner clearly stated, they were the remains of Cora Crippen and they had no further need of them. Cora Crippen could be buried. The Women's Guild held a private funeral and Cora Crippen was buried at St Pancras Roman Catholic Cemetery in Finchley. October the 18th, 1910, saw the trial of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen opening, with presiding judge Lord Chief Justice of England Richard Webster. Representing the Crown were Richard Muir, Travis Humphreys and Samuel O'Day. Representing Crippen was Alfred Tobin, Huntley Jenkins and Henry Roome. A picture of how the murder might have happened was drawn and told to the courts by the prosecution, where they told how, and quote, Belle Elmore, Cora Crippen, had always been partial to a drink of stout when undressing at bedtime. Crippen, they said, bought a glass of stout to her, but in the stout he had added some hyoscine. It is a deadly poison, inducing convulsions and coma preceding death. Belle, Cora, drank the stout and Crippen undressed. By the time she went into a coma, Crippen was in his pyjamas. He seized his wife's hair and dragged her out of the room and down the stairs. She still had on her underwear. All this was according to plan, for the crime had been premeditated. The grave he had dug was waiting under the coal cellar's floor. He dragged the body into the kitchen and onto the table. According to the version being read out, Crippen then used his knives and scalpels to remove her head. How he disposed of the head they didn't know. The head was gone. He then dissected the body as only someone with surgical training could know how. The rest of the description was very graphic, painting an horrific picture in the minds of the jury, telling of how the skin was removed from the bones and how the remains were dragged or carried to the grave in the pajama top. He told of one piece of flesh that bore a scar about 8 inches long that was found in the grave, along with some clumps of hair, underwear and the pajama top. Lime was sprinkled over the contents of the grave before filling the hole in with topsoil and placing the bricks carefully on top. Then he smeared the coal dust on top. Where he had hidden the bones they didn't know, but they surmised he later burned them in his back garden. Odie then added that, as for the gunshot that had been reported, he believed that after Crippen had given Cora too much hyoscine after the dinner party, she passed. He was going to tell the doctor he believed it was her heart. A post-mortem would show a fatty heart, and witnesses would agree Cora had eaten and drank a lot that night. A doctor would not notice the poison as it was untraceable. But Cora became hysterical and began screaming, so he shot her in the head, hence the reason it was missing. The follow-up story of his wife going to America was put together after the initial premeditated murder story. The motive being he wanted to be with Miss Le Neve and had no money of his own. The death of his wife would allow him to be with Miss Le Neve, and after selling his wife's belongings, he would be more financially able to provide for her. After the dinner party on the 31st with the Martinettis, Cora wasn't seen or heard from again. He moved Miss Le Neve in shortly after. After about 3 days, Bruce Miller was put on the witness stand. He told how he and Cora had been friends for some years, but he hadn't seen her since 1904. They still corresponded as friends. When cross-examined, he told how he had thought fondly of her and her of him, but they were married people and that meant more to them. Their relationship was no more than friendship. Dr. Pepper was next, stating that the body had something that was interesting. A mark on the abdomen that appeared to be a scar, more importantly an old scar. He concluded that the remains had been buried for at least 4 to 8 months and stated that it was quite impossible that they were buried there before September 1905. They also found some bleached blonde hair strands and pieces of a pajama jacket that matched the odd pajama bottoms Jew had found. Dr. Spilsbury concluded that the scar on a small piece of skin was over a year old and certainly from an operation performed on the lower abdomen. The police surgeon, Dr. Marshall, also repeated what the 2 doctors had stated. The defence had their own doctors, both of whom denied the marking could possibly be a scar. On the actual cause of death, Dr. William Wilcox had tested the viscera of the corpse and found traces of hyoscine hydrobromide, a drug which is a powerful narcotic poison. In this case, it must have been taken orally. The patient would become drowsy and unconscious and completely paralysed, depending on the amount given. Death would result in a few hours. Chemist Charles Hetherington knew Crippen as they both worked on the same street, and Crippen did use this pharmacy often. On the 17th and 18th of January, Crippen purchased 5 grains of hyoscine hydrobromide, saying he was using it for homeopathic reasons. This was the first time he had bought the hyoscine. The defence relied on witnesses that knew him, and all spoke of him as a very nice, amiable man with a kind heart, and how if someone had done something so terrible, surely their manner would have changed. They wouldn't be able to carry on as normal. But Crippen acted like he always did. They didn't see any change in him. Tobin said that people left all the time, marriages break down. Mrs. Crippen left, nobody knows where she was. It doesn't mean that she was dead. Tobin claimed the Hyacinth was bought and prepared for some obstinate cases, those who suffered with nerves. None of this could be proved. When Crippen took to the stand, he stuck to his story that Cora had left when he returned home from work at his normal time of 7:30 p.m. She had just gone. He then explained his motives for saying Cora had died. He said he admitted to Jew that he had lied. When asked why he had lied, he said Cora had asked him to cover up the scandal. I wanted to hide anything regarding her departure from me the best I could, for both our sakes, he said. Crippen said he had told Jew the truth, but Jew told him it was imperative that he produce his wife or he could be in serious trouble. Jew, Crippen claimed, had told him if he doesn't produce his wife quickly, his statements would be in all the newspapers the next day. So he made his mind up to leave for Quebec. Apparently, a disgusted Jew vigorously denied saying anything like that at all. Crippen had lied under oath, just as he had to Cora's friends. He went to great pains to point out that Le Neve didn't know anything, only that Cora had left him and had died later from an illness. When Crippen was asked about the remains found in his house, he said he knew nothing about them. On cross-examination, Muir asked him if anyone at all had seen or heard of Mrs. Crippen since the Martinettis last saw her after the dinner party. He replied no. Could anyone prove she'd even left the house? No. Did he know of any person in the world had seen her alive? No. Do you know of any person in the world who had received a letter from her? No. But you made no inquiries? No. You made no inquiries at all, knowing that it could help your case? I made no inquiries. He didn't even ask Dew, when told he was being charged with his wife's murder, how she had died. He didn't show any surprise at all. The same pyjamas that had been found with the remains had been sold to Crippen, the retailer would confirm. It was also discovered that the pyjamas were not supplied until after 1908, so the remains, along with the pyjama top, could only have been put there after that date, and it's during the time the Crippens lived there. Did Crippen know how they got there? No, he said, he didn't. Crippen claimed to have decided to leave the day Dew and Mitchell came to see him, claiming he thought he'd be sitting in jail for months or even a year until they found his wife. When the cross came from Mr. Muir, why would he think he would be in jail? Crippen answered he thought it would be because of suspicion. Continuing after a pause, Dew had said, "This woman must be found." Crippen's case was growing weaker. Muir pointed out that why did Crippen feel he had to write to Cora's friends if he thought she was just missing? How would he know that she hadn't or wasn't going to write to them herself? The cross-examination was going well. On closing, the defence said that Crippen's failure to look for his wife was because he was happy to be rid of her, as it meant he and Miss Le Neve could now be together. Tobin suggested Crippen didn't really care where his wife had gone. They claimed that Crippen couldn't have taken his wife's life on the 1st of February, then went to work on the next day as usual, before returning to dispose of the body the way it had been described, then tidy up and regain his composure before Miss Le Neve arrived. To save face for both he and his wife, he decided the best way to avoid a scandal was to say she had left for America and then unfortunately died of an illness. Tobin claimed the letters were an act of kindness to hide Mrs. Crippen's shame. "Why did they run?" he said. "They were afraid." Lastly, Tobin made it clear to the jury that the remains hadn't been identified as a female, let alone Mrs. Crippen. The prosecution played heavily on the fact that Crippen was a liar, in fact a compulsive liar, i.e. the letters he had sent to Cora's friends and about her death. How he even sent a letter to her family telling Cora was no longer alive. The distraught family told of how he had even wrote it on black-edged paper. Why would you even think to do that when you thought she may still be alive somewhere in America? Then there was the fact he failed to mention he was the one who was being unfaithful, but made a great hue and cry about thinking Cora was having an affair with Bruce Miller, which was apparently absurd as they hadn't even seen each other for 6 years. Muir added, although they didn't definitely know that the remains found were that of Cora, there was more than enough evidence to point to the fact she was now deceased. The hair strands found with the remains were of dark colour and bleached blonde, and we know that Cora used to dye her hair. The scar on the abdomen could point to Cora, as she had an operation there sometime between 1892 and 93, which her half-sister attested to at court. Then there is the hyacinth Crippen purchased, but couldn't provide proof of where he had used it in his work, and the remains had traces of it still inside. And then, obviously, there was the pyjama top. The whole trial lasted 5 days. The jury was sent out after instructions from the judge. 27 minutes later, they returned with a guilty verdict. Crippen remained composed and protested his innocence. Judge Lord Alverston passed sentence on Crippen. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was hung at Pentonville Prison on the 23rd of November 1910, and is buried in the prison cemetery. What happened to the head, bones and limbs of the remains would never be known. The case was worldwide news and made Crippen infamous throughout the world. He was seen as one of the most evil and dangerous men ever, with his name becoming synonymous with the likes of Jack the Ripper. However, 2 weeks before he was hanged, he wrote, "I am innocent, and someday evidence will be found to prove it." Ethel Le Neve went to court on Tuesday the 25th of October 1910. She was charged with assisting Crippen to escape justice at a time he was suspected of taking the life of his wife. Le Neve pled not guilty, stating she knew nothing of Mrs. Crippen's death. According to her defence, Crippen had told her the same story he had told Dew, but Dew had noted when arrested she didn't make any remark or any statement. This in itself felt to Dew she knew more than she claimed. But there was little to go on, and Ethel Le Neve was found not guilty and released. However, about a year later it was discovered by chance that Le Neve had forged Cora's signature to obtain money from Cora's post office savings account between April and June 1910. They decided not to prosecute. Apparently Ethel married and had 2 children. But there are different stories as to what happened to her after the trial, so I'll just say, after some investigative work from an author, it was found that Ethel had married a Stanley Smith in Wandsworth. Ethel Smith had passed away in 1967, aged 84, at Dulwich Hospital, taking her secrets to the grave with her.